I want to talk about the face to face. I can't imagine it, yet I can. And when I do imagine it, I feel so uncomfortable. I feel like a fly on the windscreen, you know? And yet at the same time, it's fascinating. This is the deepest electromagnetic bond that you can imagine. You have the singular faces. They're rooted in a specific monopole that's only concentrated on attracting precisely the right face. And the same thing is true for the other. Now, how they operate in that, how they register that, I have never really imagined how that design works. I mean, I've taken it in my splenic intuitive way, but I've never really done it because for me, I don't know these things until I teach them. I don't know what's stored until I say it. Those two faces, they have to come together. They have to form a core. And this is the whole foundation of how everything is going to be able to come together, because this is the foundation, it's the foundation mechanism. Bases. In April, I'm going to give a course on the immortal ones, the bases. It's such a interesting aspect of who we are. When you do a calculation and you do a calculation down to the base level, and you have the base of the personality, then you have the only consistency that operates eternally. That is, your crystal has always had that limitation or that singular perception, one of 5 possibilities. The crystals will incarnate into aerons, and they will have, basically what they will have is they will have resonance in terms of their perspective. So if you happen to have a first base and you end up incarnating as an aeron, one thing you do know is that the mammalian crystal that incarnates with you will also incarnate with a first base. It means that there are 5 fundamental variations. I've been teaching that if you really want to see what relationship is intended to be, that the relationship, that one of the things is that sameness, which is rejected by the genes because that's the nature of our bioform. That sameness is the only true bond. Now, of course, when you're saying that about sameness to beings that are differentiated and that's their process, it's really all very funny. When the core is established, the core will be established through resonance. In other words, if you have a first base aeron and it's going to find the right aeron to be face to face with, it's going to be a first base aeron. In other words, that cores are going to be built according to base. In other words, there's going to be 5 different kinds of cores. And it's those 5 different kinds of cores that establish the whole framework of how the entire mechanism works. So you know right away that there is going to be, remember, these are deeply magnetically attractive forces. You're dealing with something that's already working in an anti-magnetic environment. That's why it's levitating, and it's levitating because of the specific qualities of its ceramic and the deep, deep, deep freezing temperatures. They move because of each other. They move because of each other. If they didn't all incarnate at the same time, let's say you incarnated one aeron, they wouldn't move forever. They might, depending on the gravitational field of the environment that they're levitated on, they might in fact begin to rotate. There might be certain factors, but in terms of their own mechanism, there's no legs, no wings. Sorry for the angel worshippers, but there's no legs and there's no wings, and there's no jet fuel holes. There's nothing. So the way in which they move is that they move because they're all magnetic to each other. So there's all this pulling. There's all this pulling, and there, I assume, will be techniques of avoidance. You can rub my side, but you can't meet my face. Because the sides operate differently than the face. Oh, that's all strange. It's good science fiction. Anyway, what fascinates me is that bond. See, we don't have to stay awake. We can die. There are so many things that we can do that we assume are trouble, a pain, that we suffer with this, we suffer with that, and people dream about being immortal, and people dream about being free of pain and perfectly healthy, and all the wonderful ideas of paradise. Well, it is in that sense, after all. I mean, the Aeron is something that's really extraordinary when you think about it. I mean, it's sort of like money for nothing and chicks for free, I mean, it's like you really do finally have gotten to a place, where you can just have the ride. Now, yes, the ride is a long one. However, I don't know if that matters to them. It would matter to me. Yawn, yawn, yawn. It would matter to me. But then again, I don't know either. I mean, the idea of being immortal is, I don't want to eat forever. It's like, well, if I could be immortal and I wouldn't have to eat, if I wouldn't have to go through the drudgery of dealing with biology, but we are what we are. Aerons, it's like, well, they only have certain things to be concerned about. Remember, they all have the same personality. I mean, this is just one mechanism working. It's like the whole that controls this whole mechanism. They're the developing whole that will control that whole mechanism. One of my jokes, they might just kick the mother in the belly. I mean, this is the whole process. And yet none of that really takes place until they go through a long, long developmental program of being in the right place. Now, I assume that demands a level of awareness, recognition of the other, and communicative capacities far beyond anything we understand. And in terms of the way that I took in that information, when I took that information it seemed to me that the stage that was going to be the longest was the stage of building all the cores. There's just this mechanism. You see, side-by-side rubbing is temporary, and therefore you can learn from mistakes, or you can learn that it doesn't work right. Because, of course, everything about the way in which they align is the way in which they impact the environment around them. What I never liked about science fiction was that they were always dressing up human beings in costumes. And, you had big ears, or you were this or that. Maybe you had 25 organs instead of, whatever, or maybe you had 19 hearts, or, 26 eyeballs, or whatever the case may be. But basically, the psychology of these aliens Most of them are thugs. The psychology of it is all basically the same. It's all basically human. To me, the Aeron is really the true alien. This is another life form. It's not anything like what we can imagine. It isn't. See, I have this, I'm an artist in my core. I have a vision of this. Obviously, I was deeply impressed in the sense of impacted in my experience. And it's clear to me that at the moment that I try to get close to the Aeron, it's the same thing the moment that I try to get close to a projector or a reflector, and I realize that I'm deeply out of my limits and this is not for me and I will never get there. It's so obvious to me how alien the Aeron is. I can imagine its functionality, but I can't in any way imagine what that's like. See, look, we may be two sides in one face, but we live it all out through our face. In other words, we may be design and personality, but we live it out through our body graph. Here you're talking about something in which it's differentiated. It's differentiated. The totality is the face. But the three sides, those three sides represent the three crystals. And each of those sides operates independently in that sense. In other words, it would be like us having, a clearly defined personality over here that had its own associations, and a clearly defined design over here that had its own associations. In other words, we don't have that. We live everything out through the face. But the whole thing to recognize about the Aeron is that the Aeron isn't going to operate that way. Yes, it will have a face, but remember, that face is for only one other face. It's the bond that creates the core. It's where the concepts of soulmate come from that go back forever. Because deep, deep within us is the mystery of ending duality, and the ending of the duality is the building of the core. It's the fusing of the faces into one. And what you create, in fact, is a crystal. This is the magical framework. And then you have the sophistication of this entity, because you have, for example, when you look at the other illustration, you can see it more clearly, because you can see that, in fact, each face is defined. Each side is defined. So you have the three sides, and then you have the face, and they operate differently. So you can recognize that because the face is going to be the same as the other face, and it's going to operate through the same base, when they fuse and form as a core, there's a direct relationship outward. In other words, they're both taking advantage of the three sides on either side, and are both aware of what it is. How that operates. And yet each side is actually a different thing. It's a different thing. It's like, it's like being a three-headed snake, or a three-headed dog. It's a different thing. Each one has its own process. And because it's a fixed form, that's its Maya. It's a fixed form that one side doesn't get to see what the other side or the other side is connecting to. It doesn't. And that what the two are as a whole is locked in the mystery of the two faces that nobody will ever get access to once they meet. Interesting life process. And that face that you meet, can you imagine that? Face to face for eternity. Wow. Up close and very personal. Right there. And yet you see, it's only a horror for us because we've got differentiated personalities. It's not going to be a horror for them. I guess for them it's the equivalent of completion. Something deeper than love. Love is the yearning for completion. They are intended to experience the completion of the binary. The other thing is that to recognize that it's like those old magical amulets, that as you moved along on the amulet, different things operated because of the movement of the information and the energy, like a genetic strand. These cores being built, their responsibility after that is to find ways in which cores can bind together. And you will get cores coming together 5 at a time. And we go back to this magical number. The 5 bases, the 5 themes of cores, and then the cores coming together to form an inner structure. In other words, to form a foundation structure in which all of the aspects, in other words, the 5 perspectives, are present. Those bonds are obviously not made face to face. They're made side to side. And it's one of the things to understand. The only thing that's irreversible in the Aeron's life is who it meets face to face. And it's the most important factor in Aeron development, which is why it'll take the longest time for it to actually be completed. Because afterwards, it will simply be a matter of trying to find the right face configurations, which can be undone. They're not glued. But basically, the whole thing is to eventually, as an evolutionary process, link all of that up so that it becomes one continuous, integrated awareness system. The whole. The whole in any sense that we can imagine it. I know so deeply that it is our body, that it is a thing. I was, I was really awakened to be able to see without the interference of the delusion of space and time. The universe isn't really that big to me. It's never been that big to me. I don't stare up there anymore in awe. It's just all perspective. We are the most important force as a consciousness field within the whole realm of what we call universe. And our development is literally that it is, in fact, our body and has been responding to our consciousness field from the beginning. The fact that we're only lately self-reflective in our awareness doesn't mean that we haven't been impacting as a life force, consciousness and form. We've been impacting the totality, informing the totality, impacting the totality through the instrument of the neutrino environment. This stage of development in which the personality is all one personality, that the inherent power of what a design crystal comes to life. My design crystal's running my mouth right now. And all my body functions, my body temperature, all the reactions going on within me. Wow, it's really doing a lot. And as far as I know, because it puts my hands up into the air and drops them down, that it controls this vehicle. It stands me up, it moves me, lays me down. It is the instrument of my biogenetic life. And we as the consciousness field, we are the instrument of the totality's life. We are the instrument of its physical life. We're somewhere in the cosmic ajna center, if we could describe such a place. It's one of my jokes about love. It's in the cosmic G center, and that's far away. It's far away. We are ultimately here to get to a point that we are consciously aware of manipulating our body. In the same way that humanity as a testing ground of awareness and form, that we are manipulating nature now at an extraordinary rate of sophistication. We are affecting the body. We are manipulating the body already. And we're very primitive at it. We have to use up enormous amounts of fossil fuel and brain power. It is the role of the design crystal to manifest the biogenetic life. And we're part of the genetic material of that larger biogenetic life. I mentioned the other day my joy at the Hubble telescope going up into space. Now we could finally take a look at, open up our eye, that one eye. I hope we have two, but that's just my aesthetics, I don't care. Anyway, we open up that one eye and we're looking out there, and it's dark out there, it's murky out there. I imagine it's pretty murky when you're in the womb as well. There's a mystery in the solar plexus system. If you keep the frequency mechanism and you take away the wave quality, the solar plex becomes an instrument of transformation. It's a force, a deeply powerful force. This capacity within the rave to be able to meld into a single consciousness is the capacity of the solar plex, stripped of its wave, to violently penetrate the back seat. There is great power there. Once you clean away the emotional quality, and it's guided by the awakened awareness, the Aeron will have an ability to impact the outside in a way that we cannot imagine. The way in which we impact the outside is simply an extension of what we are. To fire a missile in space is no different than throwing a rock. It's simply an extension of the same thing. But we're talking about a form that will operate in a very different way, and a form that will be able to take advantage of magnetic fields and the capacity through magnetic fields to influence many things, many things on the outside. It's our fulfillment to be able to bring the vehicle to its point of birth, to be able to get the vehicle into the world that it belongs to. Memory. I don't know how much memory can be retained. 2 billion years, and how that's going to operate. It is clear to me that the Aeron will not be aware of its past. It's quite obvious. In the same way that I've experienced a previous cycle and know that it's really very difficult to imagine it. And there is no real memory of that. It was simply given. The Aeron isn't going to remember that it was Jack or Judy or Bowzo the dog or whatever. And I don't know how much of the memory of its developmental process will be retained when it enters into whatever its world is. After all, I don't expect it to be like us. I mean, this is just all an illusion, and it's an illusion built on the particular placement and materials and potential of this planet and this solar system and this time and so forth and so on. This is all just illusion. I have no idea what it is. It could be a big, huge amoeba. I mean, I don't know. It's not really the point for me. I can't imagine it. What I can imagine is that it will enter into its world. Very few human beings remember being in the womb. So I don't know how much identification will even exist. And since that all of the crystals, all of the forms will be endowed with the same personality crystal, I don't imagine that that's even going to be a point. However, that is our fulfillment. The fulfillment of our process is that this work that we're doing here, that is our design crystals, which are the microcosm of this whole thing, that our design crystals that are filtering and, manifesting our biogenetic life, that this is the microcosm of what the totality is all about. The totality, if it is indeed a living entity, that living entity, that the life force of that living entity has to be organized and maintained. And of course, that's the function of the design. So the Aeron, its job basically is to finish the developmental program of this pre-birth stage to come to a control point of its vehicle. In other words, to be able to operate properly within the context of the vehicle, which, by the way, it does now. It just does it now without us directly having to do anything. It's simply the byproduct of our life force and development in form. The Aeron is going to have different gifts. And just as we see that the dexterity and the seeming awareness of the fetus, how it develops in the latter stages of the third trimester, you can be certain that the capacity of the Aeron to be able to manipulate its environment is going to become more physical, if you will, and more intense as it moves towards the completion of this whole developmental cycle. Cosmic fairy tales. Let's have a break.